Stay tuned. Ahead, I'll talk with Gabe Henry about Enough is Enough, our failed attempts to make English easier to spell. Hi, I'm Dan Skinner, and this is Some Books Considered. Gabe Henry's previous books include What the Fact, 365 Strange Days in History, and Eating Salad Drunk, Haikus for the Burnout Age by Comedy Greats. He joins us to talk about Enough is Enough, our failed attempts to make English easier to spell. Gabe, welcome to Some Books Considered.
Thanks for having me, Dan. It's a pleasure.
Now, there's so much in this book, we're not going to have a chance to talk about all of it. So before we talk about a few specifics from the book, give us a brief overview. What are readers going to find here?
Well, the core of the book is that our spelling is notoriously difficult. It's clumsy. We have all these silent letters and contradictory rules. We have words like thru, though, tough, cough, which all look very similar on paper, but sound nothing alike. So this book is about the spelling reformers who tried to fix these inconsistencies and contradictions in our spelling. So they wanted to change words like laugh to LAF and though to THO, love, LUV. And this movement, known as the Simplified Spelling Movement, involved people like Benjamin Franklin, Noah Webster, Mark Twain, all these huge looming historical figures, all of whom shared this belief that they could improve society by changing the way we spell.
And one of the things you point out at the beginning of the book is one of the reasons our spellings are so messed up is that we have more sounds in the English language than we have letters to represent them.
Yeah, we are in a real mess, linguistically speaking. A lot of it has to do with our history, the history of England. England historically has been subject to a lot of invasions. The Romans, the Vikings, the French, the Germans, over hundreds of years. And all these languages mixed and merged and mingled in England and turned into this messy hodgepodge that we know today as English. And that accounts for a lot of our silent letters, a lot of our strange word pairs like daughter and laughter, which don't rhyme, and choir and liar and pyre. None of these rhyme. And it's because we call English, one language, one linguistic strand, but really it's many strands wrapped into one.
And one of the things you point out in the book is about the spelling bee, and we'll talk a little bit about the history there, but in some ways it was designed to help kids with this mess that our language is, but on the other hand, it also just sort of codifies those strange things about our language.
Right. So the spelling bee, our first national spelling bee in America, came about in 1908, and this was at the peak of the simplified spelling movement. It was only 2 years prior that Theodore Roosevelt, the U.S. president, had brought simplified spelling into the White House. He had directed all federal employees to begin spelling more simply, and he gave them a list of 300 words that he wanted everyone to use. So this was a point in American history where spelling really was kind of, it was a big question. What was our spelling going to look like? What kind of changes would happen to it in the 20th century? So the spelling bee came about as this rebuttal, in a way, against the simplified spelling movement. One newspaper even called it a flagrant defiance of the movement. And it was a way to kind of reclaim traditional spelling, to reassert the dominance of this conventional way of spelling in English, and to kind of give it more prominence over the simplified spellers.
And as you point out, yes, that helped maybe solidify it in the minds of a lot of people, but it didn't solve anything. In fact, it just perpetuated the issues we have with spelling. And I think about kids being taught about phonics and everything, but that only goes so far because it doesn't account for all these weird spellings that exist in the language. So, yeah, you might sound it out and think that it's spelled this way, but in reality it's spelled that way.
Right. Few of us can remember, unless we're non-native speakers, but you were always told to sound it out. If you can't spell it, sound it out. So you get a word like room and ROOM. That's simple enough. But then you get a word like tomb or womb. And there's no 5-year-old who can logically comprehend that. The best you can do is kind of commit it to memory. But then you have this form WOMB, and then you get a word like comb. So there's no one set of rules that work for everything across the board. And our language is unique in that.
And you point out some rules like, I before E except after C and those sort of things don't really help in the long run because there are so many exceptions to that rule.
Yeah, more exceptions than inclusions, probably. Too many exceptions to call it a rule, at least.
One of the things you point out, I believe it's in the 1920s, that the advertising industry got into this whole craze for K. Tell us a little bit about it.
So simplified spelling, for most of its history, was the domain of educators, professors, editors, right? It was a fringe literary obsession. But then that changed when Theodore Roosevelt brought it into the national conversation. And forever after that, simplified spelling became part of pop culture. And you see it most in advertising in the early 20th century. And in the 1920s, especially, you see this fad for the letter K. So you have brands like Kleenex and Kool-Aid and Rice Krispies and Krispy Kreme, of course. And linguists at the time had a name for this. They called it the craze for K, and they blamed it directly on those simplified spellers who had been pushing words like character with a K and chorus with a K since the days of Benjamin Franklin and Noah Webster.
A very interesting part of your book for me was I didn't realize some of the historical significance that came with these efforts to simplify spelling. And one was the connection to the abolitionist movement. Tell us about that.
So in the mid-19th century, simplified spelling tended to overlap with these other countercultural, progressive, reformist movements. Things like abolition, as you said, things like women's suffrage, the temperance movement, mysticism, homeopathy. And these were all efforts to kind of purify the soul of America or the soul of the world. And abolition fits in that a lot of abolitionists viewed simplified spelling as this tool that might accelerate literacy among newly freed slaves. So obviously slaves were prevented from literacy during their enslavement. And then when they were released into the world, there's suddenly this new population that can't contribute to society, or at least they can't vote in society. They can't participate in the civics. So literacy was very important. And they believed, these abolitionists and reformers believed, that the key to opening this gate would be a simpler phonetic spelling, and that if we could get the whole country to adopt it, then it would raise all boats. So in the years after the Civil War, many simplified spellers traveled the South teaching the rudiments of this phonetic orthography to newly freed communities.
The connection to shorthand and the women's movement, I thought, was interesting on a couple of different levels. Not only what it did to sort of empower women who sort of had this secret language that they learned that enabled them to hold important places in the world of business, et cetera, but it also offered a solution to a lot of the problems with spelling. And, you can imagine a world with, what if we all learned the write in this shorthand? Maybe that would have solved some of these problems.
Right. So the shorthand movement, the Pitman shorthand, became very popular in the 50s and the 60s, 1850s, 1860s. I should indicate which century I'm talking about. When you're doing a 500-year history, you always have to put that century first. And the first professionals to utilize Pitman shorthand were men, because these were the people who filled the roles of stenographer and secretaries. And that started to change in the 1860s. A lot of it had to do with the Civil War and men vacating their roles. But in the 1860s, women started filling these roles more. And stenography went from this primarily male position to an almost exclusively female one. And it was aided in part by these women's shorthand schools that taught shorthand, and they were exclusive to women. And some of these schools doubled as meeting spots for suffragists. So naturally, these groups commingled. The suffragists learned the art of shorthand, and the stenographers joined this feminist fight. And together they became linked in the struggle for women's rights. And Pitman shorthand itself became this kind of symbol of female empowerment, because it quickened the pace which women could take down transcription, and therefore increased their productivity and efficiency and empowered them in their professional roles.
Another aspect of the effort to simplify language, you talk about the role of popular culture, and you tell about the Phunny Phellows. How do they contribute to this?
As simplified spelling started gaining momentum in the mid-1800s, America's humorists couldn't resist poking fun at it, and a group of writers calling themselves the Phunny Phellows, funny spelled PH, Fellows spelled PH, they turned simplified spelling into this irreverent form of humor, and they became very famous for their deliberately misspelled humor pieces. These were people like Josh Billings, Artemus Ward. Some critics even grouped Mark Twain with them because Mark Twain loved dialect writing. You see it in Huckleberry Finn. And this was just this offshoot of the movement that, in a strange and indirect way, gave rise to what we know as the art of stand-up comedy, because a lot of these funny fellows, they took their deliberately misspelled dialect writing on the road and they would perform them for live audiences. And this was kind of the moment where the one-man show, the one person on stage talking to a crowd, making them laugh, became a very popular form of art.
And in more contemporary times, you talk about, recording artists, et cetera, using alternate spellings of words to draw attention to themselves and to their art.
Yeah, anyone who loves the English language like I do knows that if you see a misspelling somewhere, it catches your eye. It makes you do a double take. And for advertisers and for pop musicians, sometimes that double take, that extra split second is just enough. It's just what you need to separate you from the crowded field of other artists. So in the 1960s, you see the Beatles spelling their name with an A, B-E-A-T, and the Byrds with a Y, and the Monkees without a Y. It continues through the 70s, bands like U2 and Def Leppard, and I think it kind of peaks in the 80s with Prince, who had a unique way of spelling all or many of his song titles, a lot of his albums. Songs like I Would Die For You with the number 4 in place of the word for, and the letter U in place of the word you, and Nothing Compares to You. And obviously, this continues today. All you have to do is look at the Billboard charts, and you'll see remnants of this fad for misspelling in music.
Now, as you point out, throughout history, there have been efforts to make these changes. And by and large, they failed, although a lot of things in advertising have become kind of commonplace, like THRU for through. You don't get thrown by seeing that. It just seems natural. And there are other words that are that way too. And you point out in the book that perhaps the new vanguard for this is social media and texting and those sort of things. Tell us a bit more about that.
I do think that what we're seeing in texting and social media, the informal abbreviations, the digital shorthands that we use, things like typing the word you as the letter U, or the word though as THO, which are very common. Even my dad uses both of those, and he's not of the generation you would expect to be using those. And I think that what we're seeing is some kind of, it's like it's an indication of where our language is going. All formal changes in language begin with informal habits. And I think we're seeing something that down the road, maybe a century from now or 2 centuries from now, we'll see that a lot of these words, these simplifications, becoming more part of our formal language. You see it already with OMG and LOL, which are in Webster's dictionary. They're in Oxford English Dictionary. And you mentioned the word thru, THRU. Well, in the 1930s, we started using the word throughway, spelled THRU way. That is also now the formal version of the word. So I think what we're witnessing is this slow adaptation to our fast-paced internet world, this evolution. And I think we're seeing the little early echoes of it, the little early hints. And I don't know what words will eventually catch on and which ones will fall off, but I do think that the digital world we live in now is pushing us toward a faster, simpler way of doing things.
So do you think that's part of why simplification movements in the past failed, because they were trying to force too much change too fast, and that something like the social media you're talking about over time will just kind of sink in to the culture, and through that gradual change, we'll actually see simplification.
Right. I think it's a difference between top-down approach and bottom-up. I think the top-down approach that all these simplified spellers have tried for hundreds of years, in which they're coming from a place of elite literary status or elite political status, and they're trying to come up with a radical system for the population to accept. And the population doesn't like accepting overarching new systems like this overnight. These changes in language have to happen gradually, I believe. They have to happen informally, and they have to happen unconsciously. And what we're seeing now is this bottom-up approach, where every time I text a friend some simplified spelling version of a word, I'm casting my vote for this simpler way of doing things. And overall, I think you accumulate all those tiny little changes over time, and it turns into one major change. And I guess we'll see in 100 years, I'll come back on your program and we can discuss where our language is.
And the other thing I should point out about this book, because we've engaged in a somewhat serious discussion of this, but the book is filled with humor. So don't expect a dry, historical dissertation about language. This is a lot of fun to read.
Thank you, Dan. I hope that people will get a lot of enjoyment out of it, a lot of information out of it, but a lot of fun. Spelled Phun.
To learn more, the book is Enough is Enough, Our Failed Attempts to Make English Easier to Spell. It's by Gabe Henry. Gabe, thank you for talking with me today.
Thank you so much, Dan.
If you would like to purchase Enough is Enough, I've placed a link for you in the description below. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you know when I post new interviews. Meanwhile, here are 2 more books you might find interesting. I'm Dan Skinner. Thank you for watching this edition of Some Books Considered.